Dr. Marcus Reynolds has always believed in science. As a forensic doctor for the FBI, he had seen it all, or so he thought: brutal homicides, inexplicable accidents, charred bodies. Nothing shook him. But that morning, when he got the call to investigate the Jamison family case, something sounded different. The authorities seemed more nervous than usual. Their voices carried a weight that Marcus recognized as more than simple concern. The family had been missing for years, and their bodies had just been found. But there was something about the hushed tone of the FBI agent on the other end of the line, something that made Marcus's stomach turn. The kind of details that are not revealed in official reports, but that whisper disturbing truths. When Marcus arrived at the crime scene, his instincts, which never failed, told him that this would be one of those investigations that would change him forever. There was something wrong, terribly wrong. Little did he know, the answers he sought would not only challenge all his medical understanding, but put him on a collision course with forces far beyond his control. The mystery surrounding the preservation of the bodies, the lack of decomposition after years, and the nagging feeling that he was about to discover something the government wanted to keep buried. Everything seemed to scream, "Get out while you still can," but Marcus was already too involved to back out. And as the first evidence emerged, he could barely imagine the doors he was about to open, doors that should never be unlocked. The air at the crime scene was thick, permeated with an unnatural stillness. The place where the bodies of the Jamison family were discovered was in a remote rural region, surrounded by dense trees and a sense of isolation that seemed more oppressive than reassuring. Marcus parked his car and walked slowly to the circle of stones where the bodies had been found. He had already dealt with many bizarre cases, but as he approached the scene, he felt a growing anxiety, an inner alertness that he had never felt before. The circle of stones, meticulously arranged, surrounded the bodies in a kind of morbid ritual. Bobby, Sherilyn, and little Madison were lying side by side, their faces turned toward the sky. What immediately caught Marcus's attention was the almost impeccable condition of the bodies. They were not decomposed, nor dried out by the passage of time. Their faces, pale and serene, seemed to be in a state of deep sleep, as if they had died the night before. Marcus walked around the circle, carefully observing every detail. There was a strange symmetry in the way the bodies were positioned. His hands were crossed over his chest, his feet aligned perfectly. There were no signs of explicit violence. The surrounding grass was untouched, as if nothing unusual had happened there. And yet the atmosphere was filled with an invisible tension, as if something terrible was about to be revealed. As Marcus knelt down to examine Bobby's body more closely, he noticed something strange. There was no cadaverous rigidity. After so many years, this was simply impossible. He knew that a body, after so long, must be in an advanced state of decomposition. But the victims' faces were intact, the tissues without signs of deterioration. A thin layer of dust covered the clothes, as if the bodies had recently been left there. When Marcus took out a tissue sample for further analysis, his gaze fell on an eerily precise scar on Bobby's wrist. It was as if he had been tied up, but there were no signs of a struggle. Even more intriguing, the scar did not look natural, but rather the result of something deliberate, as if someone had done it with surgical precision. Marcus looked around, the silence of the forest broken only by the distant sound of wind through the trees. Something was deeply wrong here, and he knew that the mystery that was beginning to unfold would not be easy to understand, nor to accept. Back at the lab, Marcus began the autopsies with a nagging feeling in the back of his mind. The condition of the Jamison family's bodies defied everything he knew about human decomposition. But it was when he began examining the internal organs that the true extent of the bizarreness came to light. When opening Bobby Jamison's body, the shock was immediate. The organs were in perfect condition, as if the man had been alive until recently. The heart, the lungs, the kidneys, they all seemed intact, functioning normally. The impression Marcus had was that he was dealing with a fresh body, not someone who died 4 years ago. But what disconcerted him even more was the fact that the organs were surrounded by a substance he had never seen before. A kind of formaldehyde, but with a purity and chemical composition that defied any known medical standard. Upon investigating further, he found something that made him shudder: small metal implants. They were embedded in Bobby's muscles and around his joints, as if they were part of a deliberate intervention. But who would do that? And why? Marcus collected samples, feeling the gravity of what he was discovering. These implants did not appear to be of common medical origin. They were extremely advanced, with technology he had never seen in years of his career. Sherilyn's body revealed yet another enigma. When examining the uterine tissues, he found cysts filled with a viscous black liquid, something that made no sense within any biological explanation. Her uterus appeared to have suffered repeated damage, as if she had been forced to regenerate multiple times. And in her breasts, Marcus found a thick, grayish liquid, something that was neither blood nor milk. The feeling that the bodies had been manipulated beyond human recognition began to solidify. The most disturbing discovery came with Madison, their 6-year-old daughter. His organs were completely altered. The intestines were long and thin, and their skin in some areas had a reptilian texture. The girl's heart was hardened, almost as if it had turned to stone, and Marcus found small devices in her brain suggesting that someone was trying to control or monitor her brain activity. Nothing he was seeing made sense. There were no clear answers, just more questions, and he knew without a shadow of a doubt that someone, somewhere, was watching closely, and that he was getting closer to something he should never have discovered. When Marcus sent his preliminary findings to his superiors at the FBI, he expected some kind of reaction. However, the response he received was frighteningly immediate and definitive. Within hours, 2 agents showed up at his office, dressed in impeccable suits and sunglasses, with no visible identification. They handed Marcus a sealed envelope with direct instructions. Forget what they had discovered, classify the case as a death due to prolonged exposure to the environment, and continue with the official explanation of bodies in an advanced state of decomposition. That meeting was the first time Marcus felt the weight of the conspiracy. The men offered no explanations and accepted no questions. They just warned him in a cold and impersonal way that continuing to investigate that case could have serious consequences. For him and for those around him. The threats were not explicit, but their tone and posture made the message clear. Farkas, however, was not the type of man who was so easily intimidated. What he had found could not simply be ignored. Those bodies, the implants, the strange liquids and scars, none of it fit into a conventional explanation. And the speed with which they tried to silence him made him realize he was dealing with something much bigger and more sinister than he could have imagined. That night he received a second visit, this time even more disturbing. Parked in front of his house, a black car with tinted windows sat idle for hours. Marcus watched the vehicle through his living room window, the feeling of being watched growing by the minute. The driver never left the car, but the simple fact that he was there, watching, was enough for Marcus to understand that his actions were being monitored. Deciding not to be intimidated, he began to investigate on his own. He rummaged through old files, got in touch with colleagues who had already dealt with bizarre cases, and slowly discovered a disturbing pattern. Other families, other bodies, other investigations mysteriously hushed up. It was clear there was more at stake than just a missing family. The government, or at least part of it, seemed involved in something much darker than anyone could imagine. As the days went by, Marcus found himself involved in an increasingly intricate web of secrets. With each attempt to move forward with the case, more obstacles emerged. Files disappeared, emails were blocked, and his superiors at the FBI began to treat him with suspicion. He knew something much bigger was being covered up, but the extent of that secret was still incomprehensible. Marcus began connecting the pieces. He discovered that other forensic doctors had encountered similar cases: disappearances in rural areas, anomalously preserved bodies, strange implants, and invariably, all cases ended identically. Forensic doctors were pressured into silence. The fate of those who refused to cooperate was unknown. Some simply fell off the radar. Others, as Marcus discovered in his research, had their lives turned upside down. A confidential contact, a former FBI agent now living in seclusion, revealed even darker details. There were rumors of a clandestine program, a secret project involving human experiments of unimaginable magnitude. The government, or at least a fraction of it, was involved in something that transcended the boundaries of known science, biological and technological experiments that attempted not only to modify human biology, but also to control it. The bodies of the Jameson family, Marcus now understood, were just the tip of the iceberg. The modifications found in the bodies were not accidental. They had been deliberately manipulated, used as guinea pigs in an experiment far beyond the scope of any contemporary medical knowledge. Most disturbing was what was still unclear: who was behind it, and because. The more Marcus discovered, the more of a target he became. The anonymous calls began to increase, increasingly threatening. He knew he was being watched, and the constant presence of the black car in front of his house was a constant reminder that time was running out. His days were numbered unless he could find a way to expose the truth. The problem was, who would believe him? Marcus's nights became increasingly disturbing. Whenever he returned from work, the black car was already there, parked a few meters from his house, its occupants always hidden by the dark windows. For the first week, he still tried to ignore it, but the presence became more oppressive every day. One such night, after spending hours reviewing the Jameson family files, the phone rang. The sharp sound of ringing in the silent room made his heart race. On the other end of the line, there was only silence. He waited a few seconds until a low, husky voice finally spoke. "Leave it alone, Doctor." "Reynolds, you don't know what you're dealing with." The words were followed by the click of the line being disconnected. Marcus stood there, motionless, with the phone still in his hand. That voice was new, different from the veiled threats and suspicious looks at the FBI. This was a direct, clear, and very real threat. Marcus knew he should stop. All the evidence indicated he was going too far. However, something inside him didn't allow him to give up. There was something deeply wrong with this case, and he was determined to find out the truth, even if it meant risking his own life. But things quickly got worse. The next day, when he left home, he noticed that the black car was no longer in front of his house. A temporary relief came over him, but that feeling soon evaporated. When he got into his car, he saw a letter on the passenger seat. There were no envelopes, just a folded note with a simple message. "You're going too far." The feeling of imminent danger grew within him. Whoever he was, these people had access to his home, his life. The FBI, a parallel organization, he didn't know for sure, but what was clear was that he was being watched closely, and if they could get into his house, they could do anything to him. Marcus, however, decided to continue. Fear began to mix with stubborn determination. He couldn't stop now. From that moment on, Marcus knew he was alone. Any attempt to take his findings to his superiors at the FBI would be futile and potentially dangerous. He decided to act on his own, following the clues he had discovered. He began detailed research work, tracking connections between similar cases of disappearances. What he discovered was frightening. Several other forensic doctors who had worked on cases with inexplicably preserved bodies had disappeared or faced similar threats. To better understand what was happening, Marcus decided to contact a source he believed was involved in similar cases. An old college classmate, Dr. Henry Garrison, now retired, had investigated a very similar case years ago. When Marcus arrived at Henry's house, he was greeted with obvious distrust. Henry didn't invite him in, preferring to keep the conversation on the porch. His eyes were alert, always checking his surroundings, as if he were waiting for someone. Garrison revealed that, in his latest investigation, he had found a pattern similar to what Marcus was seeing. Preserved bodies, precise scars, and evidence of biological manipulation. He had also been threatened, and fearing for his life, abruptly retired and isolated himself. "These bodies, Marcus," he said in a low, tense tone, "are not natural. Something or someone has altered them. And whoever did this doesn't want the truth to come out." Upon leaving Garrison's house, Marcus was even more determined. He knew there was something much bigger at play, something that surpassed any known scientific explanation. But now he had a new lead. Other similar cases, and the certainty that he was not the only one being silenced. He began compiling a list of names and investigating each one, looking for patterns. With each new piece of information he discovered, the puzzle became clearer, but also more terrifying. He knew he was dealing with something far beyond his medical understanding, and that dark forces were involved. And the deeper he went, the closer he got to the truth, and the more dangerous his life became. As Marcus dove deeper into the investigation, he came across a name that kept coming up repeatedly in missing persons cases: Claire Daniels. She was one of the few living witnesses who had ever been involved with a victim in one of these bizarre cases. Claire had been a close friend of one of the missing families years before, and claimed to have witnessed something no one would ever believe. Determined to hear her out, Marcus contacted Claire, who was initially hesitant to speak. She had spent years in seclusion, tormented by her memories and terrified by the threats she had received after trying to publicize her story. When Marcus tracked her down, Claire was living in a small cabin in the mountains, isolated from the world. He convinced her to meet with him, ensuring that everything she said would remain secret, at least for now. When they met, Marcus immediately noticed that Claire was emotionally shaken. His eyes, sunken and marked by fatigue, revealed years of fear and distrust. They sat in a discreet cafe away from prying eyes. Claire spoke in a low voice, her hands shaking slightly as she held the coffee cup. "They're not dead," she said, her voice filled with suppressed despair. "People think the bodies are dead, but I saw something. Something changed in them before they disappeared." She said that months before her friend's family disappeared, she noticed strange behavior. They talked about voices and visions, as if something or someone was communicating with them in inexplicable ways. Then, one night, Claire witnessed a disturbing scene. In the family's backyard, a hooded figure was performing some kind of ritual. She couldn't see his face, but she could feel the strange energy in the air. That night, the family disappeared. Since then, Claire has been watched, chased by cars without license plates, receiving threats over the phone and being told to forget what she saw. Her testimony was dismissed by authorities, and she isolated herself, afraid that she would be the next victim. Without telling Marcus everything, she knew she was taking a big risk, but she also felt like it was her last chance to expose the truth. Marcus, in turn, was more convinced than ever that the conspiracy he was unraveling was much more complex and profound than he could have imagined. With Claire's testimony echoing in his mind, Marcus decided he needed to go beyond testimonies and rumors. The only way to discover the truth would be to investigate the government's most secret and confidential files. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he also knew there were gaps in the official investigations, documents that had gone missing, reports altered. It was clear that someone was covering something up. With the help of a former FBI contact, Marcus gained access to an unofficial database, where confidential and buried files were stored. He spent days going through the records, cross-referencing information, and connecting dots. Then he found something that made him freeze. The name of a government initiative called Anathema Project. The project had been ongoing for decades, involving human experiments under the guise of scientific and technological advances. The goal was to create a new kind of human being, stronger, more resilient, and above all, more controllable. These experiments were not new, but they were becoming increasingly sophisticated. Over the years, government scientists had conducted biological tests on humans, altering their genetics, manipulating organs, and, in some cases, installing brain implants with the aim of controlling their cognitive functions. That explained the bodies of the Jameson family. They were not victims of an ordinary death. They were guinea pigs in a terrible experiment. Marcus was horrified to discover that the victims of the experiments were ordinary people, generally chosen for their vulnerability or for the fact that they lived in rural and isolated areas, where their disappearance would not generate much repercussion. The government was not only aware of the experiments, but also sponsored them. The preserved bodies Marcus found were the result of these failed experiments, attempts at biological manipulation that were discarded when something went wrong. Even more shocking was the discovery that scientists involved in the project were developing a new type of implant, something that could literally control people's emotions and actions. Marcus realized that those implants he had found in the bodies were not for monitoring, were for control. The idea of a government secretly developing a way to control human minds was terrifying. And now he knew he was involved in something much bigger and much more dangerous than any single conspiracy. As Marcus continued his investigation, he began to realize that something was wrong with himself. Days of extreme fatigue, constant headaches, and a strange feeling of disconnection from the world around him began to take a toll on him. At first, he attributed these symptoms to stress. After all, he was dealing with a dark conspiracy that went beyond his understanding. However, as time passed, the signs began to intensify in an alarming way. One day, while reviewing more documents about Project Anathema in his office, Marcus felt a sharp pain in his head, followed by intense dizziness. He stood up quickly, but the world around him seemed to spin. His senses were dulled and he almost passed out. It was at that moment that something made him stop. He realized that these symptoms were not natural. There was something else going on with his body, something he didn't understand. Remembering the autopsies of the Jameson family and the strange implants found in the bodies, a terrifying idea appeared in his mind. He ran into the bathroom and looked closely in the mirror, examining his own skin. What he feared came true. Small, almost imperceptible marks were appearing on the back of his neck, identical to those he had found on the bodies. How could this be possible? Panic began to take over his mind. He knew that those responsible for the experiments were capable of implanting devices in their test subjects without them even knowing, which led him to a terrifying conclusion. He himself could be being turned into one of these guinea pigs. Somehow, during his investigations, he had been exposed to the same technology that was being used on the victims' bodies. he began to realize that his memory lapses and feeling of being monitored were not just the result of his growing paranoia. They were in fact interfering with his body and mind. The implants weren't just for monitoring, they were trying to take control. With his health rapidly deteriorating, Marcus knew he had little time. He needed to find a way to remove the implants, or at least figure out how to neutralize their effects, before he completely lost control of himself. Desperate to find answers and increasingly aware that his time was running out, Marcus decided to seek help outside the FBI. He knew he could not trust his superiors or anyone within the government. There were greater forces at play, and they were watching him every step of the way. Marcus began investigating scientists and experts who might have knowledge about implant technology and biological control, people who could help him understand what was happening in his own body. That's how he found Dr. Evelyn Hartman, a renowned expert in neuroscience and nanotechnology who had disappeared from the academic radar for years. Marcus discovered that she had worked on a research program similar to Project Anathema, but had abandoned mainstream science after discovering how her research was being used to experiment on humans. She isolated herself, fearing for her own life, but still had valuable knowledge that could help Marcus. Through a series of clandestine contacts, Marcus managed to arrange a meeting with Evelyn in a remote location, far from any possible government monitoring. When they met, Evelyn looked worn out from years of paranoia and running away, but her mind was still sharp. She was not surprised by Marcus's findings, as she herself had been persecuted for trying to expose the ethical implications of her own research. Evelyn explained that the implants that Marcus found in the bodies of the Jameson family were an advanced type of nanotechnology capable of directly interfering with neural processes. These devices were designed to monitor, but also to manipulate, controlling the emotions and actions of individuals. What she revealed next left Marcus even more shaken. Those who suffered the effects of this technology were not only manipulated, but were also being programmed to self-destruct if they tried to resist the control. Desperate to know if there was a way to remove or deactivate the implants, Marcus asked Evelyn for help. She agreed to perform a series of tests on Marcus to see if he had also been implanted. However, Evelyn warned him, once the implants were active, it would be extremely difficult to reverse them without causing permanent brain damage. Marcus knew he was running out of time, but this parallel investigation was his only hope. Marcus knew he was getting closer to an important revelation, but with each step, the weight of the conspiracy pressed harder on him. He and Evelyn worked tirelessly, and after days of analysis, she confirmed their worst fears. Small nanotech implants were, in fact, lodged in Marcus's body. Located in the brain regions responsible for motor and emotional control, these implants had the potential to modify your behavior and, if activated, could leave you completely under the control of whoever installed them. The discovery was a devastating blow. Marcus realized that as he fought to expose the truth about Project Anathema, he himself had become one of its victims. Evelyn explained that these implants were designed to be undetectable in conventional medical examinations, being activated by a remote signal. The question that hung in the air, however, was, when and because would they be activated? The answer came in a way Marcus would never have expected. During one of his last secret meetings with Evelyn, his phone, which he always kept off for safety, rang. When he answered, a distorted robotic voice simply said, "We know where you are. Now you have a choice. Stop investigating and live, or continue and lose everything." The phone hung up before he could respond, but the meaning of the threat was clear. He had no way back. I had reached the point of no return. The government, or whoever was behind Project Anathema, knew exactly what he was doing, and were willing to do anything to prevent the truth from coming to light. Evelyn, seeing the panic in Marcus's eyes, suggested an extreme measure, using a jamming signal to temporarily block the implants from activating, giving them some time to act. It would be risky, but it was the only chance they had. The feeling of imminent danger grew by the minute, and Marcus knew that if they didn't act soon, he could completely lose control of his body and mind. Determined to deactivate the implants and expose Project Anathema, Marcus and Evelyn hatched a bold plan. They needed direct access to one of the laboratories responsible for the experiments to find out more about how the implants worked and possibly obtain definitive evidence that would incriminate those behind the project. Evelyn had a clue as to where one of the secret labs was located. Deep inside an abandoned research facility upstate, the plan was risky, but Marcus saw no other alternative. With all their precautions taken, they headed to the location on a moonless night, ready to storm the complex and gather as much information as possible. The tension was palpable, and Marcus was more alert than ever as he knew he was being hunted. However, what he didn't know was that the betrayal would come from where he least expected it. While searching through the files in the laboratory, they heard a sound in the distance. Footsteps approaching quickly. Farkas prepared for a confrontation, but to his surprise, they were not government agents. It was someone he knew well. Richard, his old colleague at the FBI, with whom Marcus had shared some of his initial discoveries. The initial shock quickly turned into distrust. "Richard, what are you doing here?" Marcus asked, his voice thick with confusion and anger. Richard, with a cold smile on his face, replied, "I'm here to make sure you don't take this any further." Marcus, stunned, realized that Richard had been involved in the conspiracy from the beginning. He had been one of the agents in charge of monitoring him, of making sure Marcus didn't go too far. Now seeing him there, Marcus understood the true extent of the betrayal. "You should have stopped when you had the chance, Marcus," Richard said, as other agents entered the lab, armed and ready to act. "This is much bigger than you realize. We can't let you destroy everything we've built." Richard's betrayal left Marcus devastated but also furious. He had trusted Richard, believing they could work together to expose the truth. Now faced with the reality that his own friend was on the opposite side, Marcus knew he was alone. Evelyn, at his side, looked at him with a mixed expression of fear and determination. They had to get out of there alive, and now there was no more room for mistakes. The only question that remained was, how would they manage to escape the compound with the evidence while being hunted by the very men they once called their colleagues? Adrenaline coursed through Marcus's body as he and Evelyn ran through the complex's dark hallways, their footsteps echoing off the metal walls. They knew that Richard's agents were close behind, and that time was against them. The final confrontation was about to happen, and Marcus knew he couldn't run away forever. He and Evelyn had to get out of there with the evidence, or everything they fought for would be in vain. Evelyn held tight to the data disk that contained crucial information about Project Anathema. The files revealed details about the experiments, the names of the scientists involved, and the senior government officials who were behind it all. It was the definitive proof they needed to expose the truth to the world. But now, with Richard and his men on his trail, getting out of that place alive was the priority. As they ran, Marcus felt the effects of the implants in his body intensify. His vision became blurred and his head throbbed with almost unbearable pain. He knew the implants were activating, trying to take control. Evelyn pulled him into a dark corner, activating the jamming signal they had planned, which temporarily blocked the implants. Marcus felt momentary relief, but knew it wouldn't last long. They needed to get out, and quickly. When they reached the top floor of the complex, they found themselves trapped. Richard and his men appeared in the hallway ahead, weapons drawn. "It's over, Marcus. You should never have gotten involved in this," Richard said, his voice cold and calculated. "This isn't over until the truth comes out," Marcus snapped. Looking up with determination, he knew this would be the decisive moment. An inevitable confrontation unfolded. Marcus and Evelyn, despite being outnumbered and without weapons, used their intelligence and the environment to defend themselves. However, during the battle, Marcus realized something that completely changed his outlook on everything. He saw Richard hesitate, just for a second. It wasn't just coldness in his eyes. There was regret, as if he too was a piece manipulated by something larger, unable to escape the web. In a last desperate act, Marcus managed to disarm one of the agents, and together with Evelyn, escape through the emergency stairs. Richard didn't follow, and for a brief moment Marcus thought he saw a glimmer of compassion in his former colleague's eyes. With the data in hand, Marcus and Evelyn managed to escape the complex. The night air felt heavy, filled with unresolved tension as they ran toward the getaway car. However, they knew that even with the evidence, exposing the truth would not be easy. Project Anathema was vast, deep, and rooted at very high levels of government. Just surviving the confrontation did not guarantee that the world would believe what they had discovered. Days later, already hidden in a safe location, Evelyn began sending the data to journalists and reliable sources around the world. They knew that once this information became public, the government would be forced to respond. But the fear remained. How many of these sources were actually reliable? Who could be silenced before the truth came out? Marcus, still suffering from the effects of the implants, knew his battle was far from over. Sitting in a dark room, Marcus reflected on everything he had been through. He had started this investigation as a skeptical forensic doctor, just trying to understand the strange deaths of a family. Now he was at the center of an international conspiracy involving mind control, human experimentation, and the future of humanity. He knew the forces he was fighting were immense, but he no longer had a choice. He could no longer run away. He looked out the window at the horizon, where the darkness of night mixed with the dim light of dawn. He knew that eventually they would find him again. Richard, the government, those responsible for Project Anathema, they would all continue to hunt him down. But until then, Marcus would dedicate himself to exposing the truth. He knew that many others were still victims, trapped in a cycle of manipulation and fear. The project could have been shaken, but it was far from being dismantled. And just as he had learned, the truth does not always guarantee freedom. Sometimes it's just the beginning of an even bigger struggle. This was the journey of Marcus Reynolds, a forensic doctor who found himself drawn into a terrifying government conspiracy. If you've been stuck on this story so far, it means that, like Marcus, you too want to know more about these dark and mysterious truths. So subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on more fascinating and dramatic stories like this. And of course, don't forget to like and share with your friends. Every click helps spread the truth, or at least the stories that make us question what's really going on behind the world's curtains. After all, who can guarantee that this is just another fictional story?